When thinking of the civil rights movement, many think of revolutionary Martin Luther King Jr., or creator of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Ella Baker. Or maybe even the Freedom Riders in Nashville, Tennessee, which began the most effective student-led demonstration. Many think of the mid to late 1960s when the movement really began. What many don't remember is what awakened the movement once again. In order to revive the civil rights movement, it took 4 college-age African American men with the courage to take a stand against Jim Crow. While there was definitely a need for change, the presence of the KKK in the southern part of the United States made protests both life-threatening and shaming. Protesters were often lynched and found large crosses burning in the front of their houses. The violence attributed to taking a stand often discouraged such activity.
What our parents told us was true, and they told us these are the rules. You don't act out verbally or physically in the presence of other people. But if you're in the case of white people, do not do anything to incite them to want to harm you or members of your family or your friends. So because your mouth can either bring you to glory or it can bring you to hell.
In high school together, Ezell Blair Jr. met Franklin McCain, often referred to as the Braun of the original protest. They became fast friends, uniting over their general frustration with Jim Crow. They both graduated from James Dudley High School in 1959 and enrolled in the historically black university, North Carolina A&T State University, where they roomed with Joseph McNeil and David Richmond, the remaining 2 of the Greensboro 4. While boarded together, McCain, Blair, McNeil, and Richmond often discussed their anger with the segregation of their childhoods. The catalyst for this anger? Discontent with being told that they could only be bystanders as their rights were violated. The frustration with Jim Crow was especially true in Franklin McCain. Franklin McCain had lived in Washington, D.C. for most of his adolescence. In northern states, Jim Crow was not as visible, and integration was widespread. The change in attitude towards African Americans throughout his adolescence led Franklin McCain to take a large leadership role in the sit-ins. When retelling the stories of their meetings, Joe McNeil recalls asking the group,
"How long are you going to be a silent observer sitting on the sideline waiting for somebody else to do something? When are you going to get off your duff and take it on yourself?"
The date was decided, February 1, 1960. While there was great courage, there was also great fear in these 4. While the possibility of bringing equal rights to themselves and other people who were being discriminated in this time period, the costs were even greater. Many enforcers and believers in Jim Crow would ridicule, harm, and sometimes kill African Americans attempting to spark social change. The place of the sit-ins? The Woolworth lunch counter of Greensboro, North Carolina. Woolworth was a diner-style restaurant with counter and booth seating. At this time of the protest, only white Americans could sit at the counters, while African Americans had to sit in the colored booths. The 4 freshmen sat down at the counter and were unnoticed until the employees realized what was going on. They were asked many times to leave, even told by an African American waitress that they were a disgrace to their race. No matter the verbal abuse they endured, they continued to sit, waiting to be served. While many of the Woolworth patrons were negative towards the Greensboro 4, there were some patrons that provided words of encouragement. In a recent interview, Joseph McNeil retells one such story.
But all these sidebar conversations were going on, and there was an elderly white woman. She had watched from the time we chose to sit down and stayed there almost until the end. But she felt that she needed to say something. So she approached Frank McCain and I, who were sitting at the lunch counter, and said, "Boys, I'm disappointed with you." And Frank McCain said, "Ma'am, why would you be disappointed in me? You don't know me." And that little woman said, "I'm disappointed because it took so long for you boys to do what you were doing."
That was the fuel they needed. When they emerged from the restaurant, local press awaited them, taking their picture and publishing it. The News and Record of Greensboro, the local paper, circulated, bringing light to the protests. February 2nd, 25 students, including the original 4, sat at the lunch counters from 11 to 3. On the third day, more than 300 students attended the sit-ins. But the protesters were met with opposition. Segregationists who beat and verbally abused the student demonstrators. The only way Woolworth staff were able to disperse the demonstrators was to announce that there was a bomb inside of the restaurant, forcing the protesters to evacuate. The local Woolworth closed less than a week after the first protests. The restaurant remained closed until June of 1960, when the restaurant reopened as an integrated lunch counter. Greensboro was only the beginning. With the publicity of such a protest, students in 54 cities across the southern part of the United States began their own sit-ins, sparking the integration of restaurants and lunch counters across the country. Diane Nash, human rights activist, led a sit-in movement in Nashville, Tennessee, only 12 days after the original sit-ins. The students entered Crest, Woolworth, and McClellan stores, which became the largest and most effective student-led sit-in in history. Inspired by the effectiveness of the sit-ins, Ella Baker, along with other protesters, formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, often referred to as the SNCC or SNCC. SNCC often helped coordinate student movements across the nation to combat the hardships of ridicule and violence. Even as the protests themselves were nonviolent, demonstrators would often sing the song "We Shall Overcome." "We Shall Overcome" inspired protesters to continue their hard work until everyone can, quote, walk hand in hand someday. The voices of SNCC and the surge of integration across the South reached the attention of the New York Times. As more and more students began to protest, the use of violence by police only increased. The Greensboro Four and many other protesters were arrested in this time. Many felt that this was a violation of their First Amendment rights, which led to more and more protests. Jails in this time period were often overflowing with people being convicted for standing up for their rights. The bravery of the protesters to risk imprisonment and their lives to take a stand for their rights showed the determination in securing equality. The judicial system had a decision to make, raising the question, does the Constitution apply when discrimination is private? The surge of freedom riders and more students taking a stand pressured courts to make a decision. Do students deserve their First Amendment rights when protesting at private institutions? The Constitution had to be reviewed once again. The thought of a societal shift frightened many, leading to violence at the protests. One student even placed newspapers burning under the chairs of the protesters. He was later arrested. The opposition only grew. In fact, KKK activity only increased as the student movement advanced through the South. In reaction to the violence, students across the country continued to protest. The power of students helped revive the civil rights movement, bringing light back to such a crucial issue. Their power in society inspired others to try and create change in a segregated society where separate was not equal. The courts, however, showed favor toward the protesters by protecting their right to peacefully protest. Integration only flourished in the South. The civil rights movement had truly been revived, bringing light to the power of students in the 1960s. In the midst of violent protests that resulted in police retaliation and continued segregation, the Greensboro Four sparked a student revolution by simply sitting down at Woolworth. The integration of the Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, inspired students to take a stand against Jim Crow. These demonstrations sparked society to make crucial decisions regarding the equality of all races. Without the bravery of the A&T Four, the civil rights movement may have never seen the power of students or seen the light of such a simple form of protest. The legacy of the Greensboro Four? Teaching students to talk truth to power.